Alberto Marquez, and in this video we will discuss the Arena Advanced Transfer module. Before we go into the topic, we need to discuss a little bit of theory or some background in order to understand this easier. First, Arena has the capacity to identify working stations that are located in some geographical point, and based on these stations we can group in that station a machine or other resources associated to it. What is most important about stations is that allows us to implement more advanced transfer situations, how entities arrive or move around from one place to another. There are basically 4 ways in which we can move the entities in between stations. Those are the connector, which is exactly what we would have been doing without stations, and it's determined by these connectors. We can use routes. The route allows the entity to travel virtually between 2 stations. It can have a delay and specify how long it takes in terms of time to get from one station to the next one. It doesn't require any additional material handling device. In other words, it is as if the entity has its own feet. That is in contrast to conveyors and transporters, in which conveyors are a continuous means of motion between stations, and transporters are discrete means of movement. We will discuss them more in detail. With the stations, we can specify alternative ways to work with stations, that are the enter and leave. And the reason for that is that leave allows us to have more than one alternative in the way that we depart the station, because we could maybe have to implement a conveyor or a transporter, and this is a way to implement it using the node leave. One new concept is the concept of sequences. So far we have considered that the destination of the next node, it could depend on the decision making, but essentially all the entities will follow the same path. Naturally that's not always the case, and depending on the type of entity we have, it might be that one type of entity visits the stations in or the processes in one sequence, and another type of parts may not have to visit all the stations, or visit those stations and processes in a different sequence. And that can be easily implemented by means of adding an identification attribute to tag which sequence each type of entity will follow. And in the sequence list, we can specify which is the list and the sequence, the order in which the entities will visit this different station. A combination of all these concepts allows us to build very complex models. We have first connectors and routes. In both cases we don't need a material handling device. Connectors cannot be associated to routes or cannot be associated to sequences. Routes means that each entity can take its own time. If we prefer to specify that the time between transfers or the transferring time is 0, we can do so. We don't need a means of transportation, and each entity has its own feet, and it works fine with sequences. Transporters are discrete means of material handling. These apply to buses, airplanes, elevators, lift trucks. And the way that this works is that we request a transporter because we are in one location, one station, and we want to go to another station. So we request a transporter. Once the transporter arrives, we actually transport, and when we get to our final destination, we can free the transporter for the transporter to be available for other requests from other entities. One characteristic about the transporter is that we need distances. The distances is a set of definitions for how long the distance is between stations. The transporters will have associated speeds, and with the combination of the distances and the speed will allow the simulation to take account of the time it takes to arrive from one place to another. The additional concept about distances that is very important is that we should consider the distances not only for the traveling path for the entities, but we should consider the distances for the traveling path of the transporters even when they are empty. The simulation package will not by itself compute a default distance if it's not specified. So when we think about how to decide the distances, we need to account for all the possible combinations that any transporter may have to travel without any entity in order to, after being freed in one location, be requested in another location, and the transporter will travel without any entities. So that's important, and sometimes that is not obvious, in the sense that we're thinking in terms of the flow of the product. In terms of the transporters, we need to think about all the combinations of origins and destinies in between stations. Finally, conveyors. Conveyors are good for representing belts, roller conveyors, or escalators. The way that these operate, as opposed to request and free, we access a conveyor. The conveyor is divided in segments, and the segments take the destination from one station to the next one. And to access the conveyor, the space is divided in subsegments, and that particular step must be free in order for us to access. So when we say access, is actually a request for an empty space inside the conveyor in order for the entity to be traveling on top of the conveyor. At the arrival of the next station, we execute an exit conveyor that, besides that it takes time to unload out of the conveyor, it also frees the space that was previously used by the entity. Segments can create loops. We can start and stop the operation of a conveyor. Therefore, the entities could be halted in the middle of the way. When we are using a combination of sequences and conveyors, we only need to specify which is the station that we will exit at. In other words, a conveyor may visit through different segments, different stations, but if it's inside the same conveyor, the entity will keep mounted on top of the conveyor, traveling through but not getting off on the stations, and only will get out of the conveyor at the destined station. We do not need to specify each one of the stations that the entity will not be exiting. And with that, we can begin to create some models in Arena.